going up. Elevator systems. Bowen family systems theory in brief for a life of learning. Welcome to Elevator Systems, the podcast that discusses Bowen family systems theory in brief and understandable ways. Today we are looking at the concept of sibling position. My name is Dixie Vandersloos. I am a youngest sister of brothers. Joining me is Katie White, who has previously admitted to being the oldest sister of sisters. And our guest today is Alejandro Astorga, who is a middle brother of brothers. So we all have different sibling positions today. Alejandro joins us today from Santiago de Chile. Alejandro is a psychologist and family therapist. He has a master's in family therapy and a master's of law in children's rights. He is the director of the Multigenerational Intervention Center in Santiago and a member of the Ibero-American Institute of the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family. He is also technical direction of Corporación Opcion, a nonprofit organization that in collaboration with the government serves 15,000 children and their families throughout Chile. So it's great to have you with us, Alejandro. And I know communicating in theory, Bowen theory in English for me is enough of a challenge, but you are doing this in a second language for you. So I appreciate the challenge. So welcome here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation to talk about Bowen theory. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, how would you give an elevator pitch of this idea of sibling position, Alejandro?
Okay. For me, the concept of sibling position is a starting point for placing individual behavior in a relational level. It's a beautiful way of saying that my behavior can be understood from the closest relational context in which I have grown up.
Great.
Yeah. Okay.
Katie.
It's my turn. So I get interested because people get so excited about thinking about sibling position. I think it's one of the concepts that people get pretty interested in. But my pitch is, I think that it comes from this idea that there are statistically certain characteristics that are typical to the order you were born in a family. And I think I wanted to say that these can show up in a very rigid way. Like I could be a very rigid oldest, or they can show up in a flexible way. Or I think one of the things I want to add, they can show up in a different sibling together. So what I mean by that is you can see a family where an oldest is functioning much more like a typical youngest. And so the variation in the way that people use this idea of sibling position in Bowen theory has to do with the interconnectedness of the other concepts. So we begin to be curious if an oldest isn't showing up like an oldest, that is there a family projection going on? Or how do we understand the parent sibling position and how that might have influenced? So I think it's an idea of a set of data that we look at to get a sense of what's going on in the rest of the family.
Hey, my turn. I wanted to use a sports analogy, but then I realized, no, I don't know sports very well. So instead, because there's so much music in my family, my pitch is going to look at this concept through music. So my family has been a family band on many occasions. We play so well together because we have each practiced many hours at our own instruments, and we have played together for decades. If we all played the same instrument and part, it would sound pretty dull. Instead, what we each do complements the other and makes interesting music. So sibling position highlights that in the family, each child has a function, role, or a way they operate that is related to where they are in the birth order of the family and the circumstances around when they show up in the family. So going back to the music, if the oldest keeps the beat going on the drums, Another sibling will be able to play the melody on the piano, and then another can add some fancy notes on the electric guitar. So each position is picked up and played in reciprocal response. And of course, we take what we've practiced in the family into other relationships. That was a long metaphor. So from Dr. Bowen, Dr. Bowen says, this concept consists of modifications of Toman's basic work on the personality profiles of children who grew up in different sibling positions. We will talk about Toman. Unless there are variables to prevent the process, children develop certain fixed personality characteristics determined by the sibling position in which they grew up. Knowledge of these characteristics is important in determining the part a child will play in the family emotional process, in predicting family patterns in the next generation, and in helping a family to reconstitute itself in therapy. He also said in one of his chalk talks, which you can see on the Bowen Center, a large amount of the personality characteristics of a person is determined by the family configuration in which he grew up. One from Roberta Gilbert, the different positions make it clear that no two children experience the family in the same way. Each position is so different from another that it is as if no two children have the same family. Understanding sibling positions becomes one more way of taking relationship glitches less personally. And then I have a quote from Toman, and then Katie is going to give us her summary. Walter Toman said, "We proceed from the assumption that a person's family represents the most influential context of his life, and that it exerts its influence more regularly, more exclusively, and earlier in a person's life than do any other contexts." So, Katie, I asked you to summarize Toman's research.
Yeah, so I am looking through Family Constellation. For those of you who can see, I'm showing the book. And so Toman was a psychiatrist and a researcher in the 1950s. He had a 10-year study where he studied over 400 families. And it has been replicated in other countries with different populations. One thing, I went into a bit of a deep dive to see what do people think about this in current research. And one thing I find interesting is that there's a debate. I mean, people think that, I think where researchers get caught is that they say it doesn't look exactly like this in every family. An oldest doesn't look exactly like this in every family, which I actually think is the usefulness of laying Bowen theory into this conversation, where Bowen theory adds that element where there are exceptions and some ways to think about the exceptions. So I wanted to add that in there. So I just thought, because we have our own sibling positions here, I would read some characteristics of oldest sisters of sisters, youngest sister of brothers, and middle siblings. So the oldest sister of sisters, which is my position, some of the things that come from the research is likes to take care of things and give orders, wants to know what's going on around her, which I've talked about in a few podcasts this season. Likes to be up to date and in control. She will work hard for others, sometimes to her detriment. And an oldest sister of sisters is a good leader. You cannot, if you want to have a little fun, go on the internet and search the memes for oldest sisters of sisters. There's some pretty funny stuff out there. So a younger sister of brothers is feminine, friendly, warm, sympathetic, sensitive, and tactful, attracts men easily, and is a good friend and employee. So again, we can have people's activity that a lot of these are based on pretty heteronormative families, that I will put that in there. And then for Alejandro, middle siblings, which is an interesting one, because middle siblings can fall into very different patterns. So one of the things that Toman talks about is it depends on many, many things. So one of the things I thought was interesting is Toman has 6 rules to think about where a middle sibling would fall when making this assessment of their functioning, which I'm not going to read today. But I thought 2 that he said were the most important are the position of the sibling closest in age. So, if Alejandro wants to share. So if he had, his older brother was 1 year difference, he might show up more like a younger brother of brothers. But if there was a big gap, he might show up more like an oldest brother of brothers. And also the factor of looking at the complement of the parent with the same gender's sibling position. So for instance, if his dad was a younger brother of brothers, the middle brother might show up looking more as a complement to his dad's position. So I thought, one of the things we talk about in Bowen theory is looking at the parent's sibling position as just some data that we can use to assess. So there's just short, this is a 500-page book, 300-page book. So there's a lot of things that if you want to deep dive about how choosing a spouse based on complementary positions might be useful, where you might get caught with your kids and where their sibling position locates, So I think if you want to really go deep dive, check out the book. It's got a lot of interesting stuff.
Well, Alejandro, what do you want to highlight from all of that information?
Well, I was thinking in 2 or 3 ideas and later maybe one example later. For me, an important idea that I want to share is that it's not just about understanding the sibling position and its implication on a temporal plane of one generation. It's involved considering the sibling position in the multi-generational context. That is involves considering the sibling position of my parents, one for one hand, and my position in the context of the behaviors that middle children have occupied in my multi-generational family across generation at the last 3 or 4 generations, for example. So this idea for me is very important. Maybe we should talk about the multi-generational sibling position. The position of siblings should always be understood in a multi-generational level. This idea is very important to me, like a first idea. And the second idea, maybe, or reflection, comment, is the orchestra analogy that Dixie proposed make a lot of sense to me. I would only add or emphasize that this is a multi-generational orchestra. I don't know how sound this orchestra in your family, but in a multi-generational level can be very interesting.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I was going to build on that and think about, first, I really appreciate in Alejandro's pitch that he embedded it in the relationship process. I think it's so important to think about siblings as a way that relationship process can be viewed. But the punch up of the multi-generational sibling position is so interesting. I laughed when I was preparing this because I come from, I think I'm the 3rd generation of oldest that land in me. So I'm parents of 2 oldest who were children of 2 oldest. So, if there is some embedded emotional process in my system about leadership, I think that, just to think of that and know that that is a process. And all of those folks were quite important leaders. There was a youngest in there somewhere. I don't know how they slipped in, but that oldest needed a little more control. But to think about how that would just be running through the current in my family. Yeah.
Yeah. In my family, I only have brothers. My husband only has brothers, and both of my parents only have brothers. So there's not a female blood relative besides my mom and my grandmothers. And I haven't done enough thinking maybe about what that means, but I have some hunches about what the women are supposed to do or what the women do in our family. So
yeah. One of the ways I was going to say, I think this is partly my example, but one of the ways I think all that oldest leadership shows up is I am, the oldest of 2 sisters, but I think leadership was emphasized in each daughter. So not just rigidly projected on the oldest daughter, but each daughter really was encouraged to take positions of leadership, which I think in one way, in a different family, that would look very different, right? That the youngest sibling might not be encouraged to take on any leadership. So I think that's one of the ways I would see variation between families, that there was some flexibility in some of the characteristics that might be present. And maybe that was because both of my parents were oldest and just began to expect that behavior from each of their children.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Bowen theory, given a more systemic and relational context at the original ideas of Walter Toman, less deterministic, more flexibility, and see other concepts and relations to understand this very interesting topic. Flexibility is one of the points, central points. I want to share a small example of a simple observation about sibling position in my family. If the age of difference between a sibling and a younger sibling it lasts 5 years, it's likely that the older sibling will behave more like an only child. This simple observation helped me a lot to understand my relation with my older brother, who is 8 years older, and to see him more like an only child. I understood my expectations better and how he see me. I understood the particular relationship he had with my father and my mother, and it is not just that of an older son. And I remember, for example, a conversation with my mother in which she told me that when she announced to my older brother that he was going to have a little brother, he said something like, "What's the point? It's not necessary." Uh, it's so funny, but I didn't have time to ask that question about my younger brother. Because for as long as I can remember, my younger brother has always been there. So I'm the middle, but my older brother helped me to uh, give another position in my sibling relationship.
I have a similar, not quite that big of a gap, but my older brothers are 5 and 8 years older than me, and my husband's brother is 5 years older than him. And because I shouldn't use the word because, but one of the factors in us having 3 kids in 4.5 years was because we felt like, I don't want to have that big gap. I want our kids to
Yeah,
play together. And then we had them young because our parents, according to 1970 standards, were a little bit older when we were both born in the family. So we did put thought into it, but I'm not sure how much thoughtful thought versus we just wanted to be different, or we could see the problems or the challenges we felt with the big age gap. And then we discovered there's challenges with the close age gap.
And the sensitivities that would have existed in the generations. I appreciated Alejandro punching up the difference between a deterministic, because when I first read Toman's work, when I had just, no, it would have been right after I just had my first child and then wasn't able to have any more children. So I had an only child. And if you read Toman's research sometimes on only girls, especially, if it's a projection into their future, it's not good. And to really be able to use that as one piece of data and not project these behaviors onto her, these ideas onto her, but to look at all the factors that exist in developing the person that she is, the whole emotional process in which she grows up in. And to be interested, as she again has 2 adult parents, I'm oldest sibling parents, to watch all those oldest sibling characteristics, the leadership, the things just naturally begin to show up in her. I get so interested how these things get communicated in a level below the surface and stay consistent. I don't understand all the ways in which it works, but I get really interested in this pattern.
Well, there's a phrase that's often connected in this discussion, which is all things being equal. And I have a quote from Roberta Gilbert that says, by that he meant that many factors other than sibling position combine to influence personality, so they may or may not be dominant in a given individual. And Dr. Papero said, every child born into a family has a different set of parents. So I wondered, just thinking about that, all things being equal, and also, when are things ever equal?
I was thinking, in strictly speaking, two children, even if they have grown up with the same parents, don't see their parents in the same way. I was thinking in the ideas of Roberta Gilbert and Daniel Papero. They had different parents. They meet them at different times in their lives. There were different levels of stress in the personal life, in the family, and their parents were of different age, and among many other things, of course. For example, my father was 27 when his first son was born, and 39 when his last was born. That is why the descriptions that the adult siblings make of their parents are so different, and sometimes so painful or funny. It is not as if they were talking about different parents. They really are different parents. This is my thinking about this part of the conversation.
I don't know if this phrase translates, but I often wonder if Bowen was being a little cheeky, like a little silly to say all things, every system is different. And how do you get curious about learning about your own system? Because things aren't equal. I mean, every branch even of a family system has differences. So part of my curiosity in that phrase was he just in his Bowen way, being a little cheeky to say his challenge, go out there, find out about your system, learn about you. It's going to be different than your spouse's system and your neighbor's system. So that was one of my thoughts. I was wondering if he was being a bit silly.
I was thinking in a continuity of the before comment in relation with one question. For example, do parents love their children equally? I don't know what do you think about this question, but this question is connected with how the children see the parents and how the parents see the children. Many clients say they love their children equally. Do you know? I don't know. What do you think, Dixie or Katie, Catherine, about this question? Do parents love their children equally?
I think it's such an interesting idea from like, what does a parent think about a principle versus what does the emotional process kind of stir up in them? I mean, as a clinician, I have definitely sat with parents who say, I don't like that kid. I really struggle with that kid, and they're a sibling I do okay with. I like them. And this is where I do again think that the lens of Bowen theory to think about the emotional process is a tool for that client I'm working with to get interested in what is it that's stirring you up about that kid that you don't like, that you really struggle with. I just think it's a useful tool. So I guess my short answer would be, I do think there's variation in how parents feel about various kids. And I think there's a lot that goes into that.
Yeah, I was thinking the North American saying is, I love them, but I don't like them. That would be, what you're highlighting, Katie. And often it I don't know if it has to do with the kid, but about the stress level of the parent. And so when you zoom out and look at all of the things going on currently in the life of the parent or the family, but then also that multi-generational piece, there's so much more factors than that kid is a problem.
What do you think, Alejandro?
I think it's as interesting at this point as an uncomfortable question, because as the parents see their children differently, the children see the parents differently, the parents see the difference between children too. As a father, I love my two daughters differently because they are different. They were born at different times in my life, and it's not about loving more or loving less. They are different, and the relationship is different too. Um, Bowen theory gives us the opportunity to see both sides of the process. We see the emotional process, like you say before, because the people say something, but the emotional process is is another thing. Is very deeper. This is I was thinking at that point.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about your comment made me think also about I work with some families where they're thinking about estate planning and how the principle of I want to be equal and give all my child equal versus this idea that I think people bump up against but don't have words for, which is the reality needs of each
Mhm.
child. And to think about the difference when parents get bogged down of I have to treat every child equally, I have to give them equal attention, I have to give them equal money, versus thinking through what would be your principles if you began to think factually about reality needs. I don't have the answer, but it's just a question that I like to throw into the mix when that's a time of pretty intense tension when people are thinking about it. Plus they're thinking about the end of their life, which is anxiety provoking anyways.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm really curious, Alejandro, because I know that you have thought about this concept in your work. And if I wrote it down, that you have done quite a bit of research on sexual abuse between siblings. And so, would you want to share some thoughts?
Yes, I have been working for more than 20 years, maybe, in the process of family violence and child abuse. And for some years, I've been working and trying to apply perspective based the Bowen ideas, family systems ideas, to sexually abusive behavior that children and adolescents, young teenagers, finally, develop toward other children. I've been focusing especially on children even younger than 14 years of age who develop these behaviors, these abusive behaviors. Some of these young teenagers have used on other children, and an important part of these children's behaviors are directed towards their own siblings. So this is an important question. It's an important topic and very challenging because we need to understand violence in a process, understand emotional process in the family, and later try to apply it to the sibling relationships. And we have to ask questions. Have there been other abusive behaviors in the family? What is the sibling position of the child who is abusing? Is the child who is harming his sibling also being abusive? For me, Bowen theory is giving me the opportunity to see the child as a part of the family emotional process. So the child develops abusive behaviors, of course, and is responsible for these behaviors, but these behaviors occur in a multi-generational context. That's what I use the question about how sexuality is experienced in the family. How did each parent experience their sexuality in the context of their families of origin? And it's very interesting because the answers are always very clear, and they always help me to consider that to help child, I must help their parents. But the child is always the entry point to the family process, and the child holds the key to the door of this process. So my work is in relation with this, to understand the abusive behavior. For one children, I need to understand the abusive behavior in the family across generations.
So, what about that bigger picture perspective helps you as, the clinician, and also what is useful about it to the family? Or how would you begin to communicate it to the family?
The first point is family diagram about with the family. The family diagram is not for me, not for paper for me, is for the family, and try to understand the story of the family, the relations, different kind of relations, help me to understand the whole process of violence. As you know, many situations of cut off before in the family, many situations of violence. And one experience for me is in many situations when I talk with the young teenagers about the situation with their siblings, the mother told me about their own experience of child abuse, their own experience with siblings, father, and it's a multi-generational process finally, of course. But my research is in a point to try to understand this process, try to give a kind of family therapy, but always in a system perspective.
Yeah. I really appreciate you sharing your work. I think it's reminded me of our conversation with Walter Smith
Yeah.
in thinking about how do you get a system interested in looking at this differently, and especially something that I would imagine would cause so much anxiety in a system. The element of sexual abuse right away gets the family anxious, it gets counselors anxious, and to be able to really see, is this a resource to the family to look at this multi-generationally? I think, how do people do their best thinking under that symptom? That intense kind of symptom is so interesting. So I appreciate you sharing your thinking.
Yeah, that's for me the idea in this point is Bowen give me the opportunity to see a symptom as a family process, a fragment of an indifferentiated process in the family. As you tell me the concept of sibling position, I need to understand in the framework of the other concept. I like the idea of always considering the different concept of the theory in relation to the rest as a really interlocking concept. You can talk about differentiation without talking about anxiety. You can talk about sibling position without talking about triangles. I speak about my mother and my older brother on process of family projection. Walter Smith talked about a couple episodes ago about family projection process in such a clear way that I can only say, come on, listen to him.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, any final, takeaway ideas, questions, or you've just highlighted, we'll have to link to the Walter Smith episode, but
Yeah.
other resources for people to keep thinking about?
I put questions down. My takeaways are usually questions to think about is, how does someone get curious about how sibling position functions in their family? And once they think about that, I often think where do I get caught in the emotional process of my sibling position versus my best thinking? So, I joke about my older sisterness. I told a story, I think, on an earlier episode where I was at a Christmas nativity play for a school, and the tension in me about my perception that it wasn't running well meant that I had to jump in and lead. And that's something that I have to really manage in myself, is to sit back. I watch it in my own family system. I luckily had a gift where I've been born into a family with 2 other competent siblings who I can manage myself, and they can step up and they can lead really well. So to notice what is your automatic, and then to just be interested, can you play around with that? So that's my takeaway that shows up in my life.
Mine, it's just a silly Instagram account, but TJ Therian, I'm not sure if that's how you say his name, but he has these funny videos every week about, I think he actually has 4 kids, but he always comments that the 4th sort of really gets forgotten. But oldest, middle, and youngest kids, and he just does these funny videos highlighting the different positions. We'll also link to Walter Toman's research. There's 2 really great Family Matters episodes on sibling position and sibling rivalry. And then, I'm not an eldest, although I do kind of fit with the only a little bit more than the youngest, but I'm going to link to that fun eldest daughter research because it's interesting.
Is there, can we make sure we link to Alejandro's research too as a resource for people? The nice part of the internet now is I can pop the article into Google Translate, and then all of a sudden, I'm sure it's not perfect, but it works. Alejandro, would you have a takeaway? Something that you wanted to make sure?
Yes. I was thinking now that it's possible to establish predictable relational patterns and behaviors from the position that a person has occupied among his or her siblings. Sibling position is a beautiful, beautiful way to see my behavior in relation with my context. It's the beginning of understanding the Bowen theory, and I suggest read Walter Toman book, and has in the context of these ideas 30, 40 years ago. And I was thinking my point is the position of siblings should always be understood in the multi-generational level. If you see the multi-generational level of siblings, you can understand better your position as a sibling in your actual generation.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Alejandro. I think it's so useful to think about this concept, especially across cultures. And thanks for sharing your work and your experience.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about Bowen theory. I hope this conversation can be useful, I hope. And I would like to keep in touch thinking in Bowen theory across cultural generations and process in Bowen theory. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And thanks to those who have tuned in today. I hope this concept has gotten you curious about your own sibling position and all the ways that it shows up as you go out into your relationships. This podcast is produced by Living Systems, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver offering counseling and training programs in Bowen family systems theory across Canada.